Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Thursday session of Indigenous Education Week. This year we are entirely virtual, so it's really exciting to try have these new conversations in a different format than we would normally do. So today we have Dr. Daryl Manitowabi, who will talk to us about the problem with placebo and nocebo in traditional medicines. A really important and very interesting conversation. Before we begin, it's extremely important to not only recognize, but to honor the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We would also like to honor the traditional territory of Atikameksheng Anishinaabeg, on which Laurentian University is situated, the traditional territory of Wanapitei First Nation, on which the city of Greater Sudbury is situated, and all and any of the treaty territories on which our viewers reside here today. Now more than ever, it is important to privilege these treaty and honor our relationships to one another and to the lands. And I think this conversation today will be very much relevant in that sense as well. It's very much an honor to introduce Dr. Daryl Manitowabi. He is now a NOSM AMS Hanna Chair in the History of Indigenous Health and Indigenous Traditional Medicine. Dr. Manitowabi is Three Fires Anishinaabe from Wikwemikong Unceded Territory and currently resides in the Whitefish River First Nation. He recently served as the Director of Northern and Community Studies at Laurentian University, and at NOSM was the Director of Indigenous Affairs in 2008 and the Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies in 2019. An Indigenous anthropologist with research interests in Anishinaabe ethnomedicine, oral history, Indigenous gambling, Indigenous social determinants of health, Indigenous healing, Indigenous state relations, and Indigenous self-determination. Dr. Manitowabi's research and publication examine how the historical legacy of colonialism indicates the health and well-being of First Nation communities. His research in the history of Indigenous health situates the place of Anishinaabe, Mwen, and knowledge in concepts of holistic well-being and wellness and health. So we're really grateful to have you with us today. I know you're very busy, so we're grateful to hear from you and to have these very important conversations.
Okay, Emily. So I will get started here. So welcome everyone to my presentation. The presentation, as mentioned, is titled "The Problem with Placebo and Nocebo in Traditional Medicine." I'm going to begin by talking about myself for a little bit. So I was invited to speak about my new position at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. And I chose to talk about my new position by way of demonstrating how the kind of research can inform an understanding of the past through a study of the history of traditional medicine. So to begin, I am Anishinaabe, so I am an educator. I am also a researcher. So quite often when we talk about these kinds of issues, we need to put out disclaimers there because traditional medicine is a very sensitive topic, and quite often just stating that in itself can raise some eyebrows. And it's important that I situate how I approach it, because I'm not here to say that I'm a healer, but I am an educator and a researcher, and this is what I do. And specific to my approach to this subject matter, I'm within the discipline of anthropology, and anthropology has historically focused on speaking to elders and knowledge holders about cultural perspectives, and traditional medicine is naturally a part of that. In early anthropology, basically the objective was to document as much as possible about a whole culture, and in the process of doing so, naturally you would come across healing, stories of healing or examples of healing, or even documentation of traditional medicines in themselves. Within the field of anthropology, we eventually transition to more specialized subdisciplines, and medical anthropology is one of those. And another subdiscipline is ethnohistory. Sometimes ethnohistory is situated within the discipline of history, but more often than not, it's situated within anthropology. So this is how I approach this work. It's through an ethnohistorical lens. And basically what ethnohistory does is it integrates the written word, as well as oral history, and maybe other non-traditional forms of history. So it's really a blending. It's a blending, and history is political. It's not always a full record, and historians must navigate the content. And that's really what I see my role being in this position. And if we think about history, the history of Indigenous peoples is a narrative of colonization. It's a narrative of land displacement. It's a narrative of attempts at assimilation through governmental policy. And so it becomes very challenging and difficult to understand what does traditional healing mean within an historical framework, because it wasn't the intention of the writers of history to go out and write in detail how these kinds of traditional practices took place. And so quite often we must rely upon what anthropologists wrote, and we also must rely upon even traveler accounts. Sometimes it's those who are working in fur trade posts who wrote down this kind of material. And most importantly, we rely upon the oral history of Indigenous peoples themselves. And so what I'd like to do then here is talk about, in many ways, a cultural understanding or an Indigenous understanding of this subject matter. So in terms of my presentation overview, I'm actually going to start by talking about what the Hannah Chair is all about. And this will serve to inform what my role is all about, but also to provide some opportunity for those of you who have an interest in this kind of subject matter, because the Hannah Chair does support research in this area. And so I'll talk about those kinds of opportunities and about the background of it. I'll provide some definitions as well. So I'm going to provide a case study of Anishinaabe traditional medicine, and some of this is based on past research that I've done, but also some research that I've come across as I've read materials, and a lot of this is an idea in progress. So it's not yet a fully developed academic argument. So if you have any questions that can help shape it, I'd really appreciate it. And I'll also talk about traditional medicine history to a greater extent than I've done so before. And what my the objective in this presentation is to really critique how biomedicine presents placebo and nocebo. And I'd like to suggest that Daniel Moorman's work on the meaning response or the meaning effect is more accurate in terms of describing this process, because there's a whole lot going on in the process of healing. There's a lot of unconscious things going on when we seek out healing and a healer, and we engage in that process, whether it's in a biomedical system or whether it's in an Indigenous system. So I can see that I actually would like to begin here. Oh, sorry, I will begin here. So yeah, I thought I was going to that material, but I'll start off with the AMS Hannah Chair in the History of Indigenous Health and Traditional Medicine. So that is the title of my new position. I started this past July, and a little bit about the position. So AMS stands for the Associated Medical Services, and the Associated Medical Services is a small Canadian charitable organization. It's a pioneer in prepaid healthcare in Ontario. And so it goes back before the time when we had public health insurance, like where we had publicly funded health care in Ontario. It was founded by Dr. Jason Hanna in 1937. Dr. Hanna was the first physician who sponsored a non-for-profit prepaid healthcare organization. So it's really the beginnings of a public healthcare system. So this was in existence up until 1969. And during that period, for instance, it provided access to private physicians that are chosen by the patient, diagnostic services, hospital care, including surgery, maternal, child care, and home visiting. And so this came to an end on October 1st, 1969, when Ontario transitioned to the National Medicare program. So before then, it provided that service. And so it created a bit of a need for a transition. And so because of this change, In 1976, it shifted its orientation to become a registered charity. And so the purpose then became to redirect its purpose to education. And so it used its original source funding, investments, and management to source research and the research chairs in this position. So this is how the research chairs have come about. And so the chairs are in the history of medicine, and there are chairs in all of the medical schools in Ontario. There's also one at McGill in Quebec, and also one at Calgary in Alberta. One problem, or there wasn't actually one in or at NOSM until 2015 when they submitted for an application for one. So just a little bit of background of the chairs themselves. So the chairs are intended to really shed light on the history of medicine. And so it comes from this idea that we don't know where we're going until we know where we come from. And it's really this purpose to situate the changing face of health in context of history. So in the 1970s, the Hanna Institute for the History of Medicine was developed, and its purpose was to oversee the role of the chairs themselves. So as the chairs meet once a year to discuss the work that they are doing. I was part of this first meeting that just happened yesterday, actually. And so for the first time, I had a chance to meet the other chairs. In 1999, before this time period, they would fund the chairs over 5-year periods. And in 1999, they shifted the funding model to fund the chairs in perpetuity. So the Hanna Institute and the local university that sponsors one partner to agree that they will fund these positions. So this is a new position then at NOSM, and it will be there for perpetuity. So something that you may be interested in if you are a graduate student, or if you're near completion of a PhD, or you're completing a PhD, the Hanna Institute offers grants and fellowships. So they offer a postdoctoral fellowship. They offer one at the level of $45,000 plus $2,500 for travel. They also offer a doctoral completion grant to help assist the completion of doctoral studies for the amount of $25,000 for 1 year. And they also provide research grants up to $10,000. So those of you who are engaged in graduate studies know that sometimes these kinds of funds aren't always available. So the Hanna Institute provides an opportunity for supporting the history of medicine. So the objective then is to support studies related to the history of medicine. So that's about a little bit about the Hanna Chair, and it's something that I will come to know a bit more about. And so if you have any questions about what I've spoken about specific to this chair and any grants or fellowship opportunities, you can send me an email and I can answer your questions then. Okay, so off to the start of my presentation. So a place to begin. So if you've ever taken an anthropology course before, or a medical anthropology course, then this will be familiar to you. However, if you haven't, then it may be a bit challenging. And it's crucial to understanding cross-cultural understandings, cross-cultural perspectives. Also, it's crucial to understanding medical systems. So within, for instance, a medical anthropological paradigm, there's a recognition that there is not only one health system. There is not only one medical system. Having all of us growing up in or living in Canada or North America, we may think that, you know, we may naturalize the fact that there seems to be only one, and biomedicine surrounds us. It's the dominant healthcare system. If we need help, we call 911, and this medical system is enacted. And if you grew up in this system, then you have a tendency to naturalize it. And so if you think outside of it, or you're introduced to ideas that exist outside of it, it may be very difficult for you to come to terms with what are the implications of that. And we have a natural tendency when we are exposed to other cultural perspectives, to be hesitant towards them, to be skeptical of them, and to even be protective, and maybe even outright reject the possibility of a coherent other medical system. And this is something that I come across quite often, more often than not. So it's almost a norm for me to come across skeptical, a skeptical audience when I talk about these kinds of things. And when I approach this material, I don't approach it to suggest that it is the center of the world, nor that it is the one unique system that will have the answers for all others, nor do I suggest that it is the greatest system in any way. As a researcher, I'm understanding systems by way of comparison, and Indigenous traditional healing is a comparative medical system that has withstood the onslaught of colonialism. And I have an interest in understanding how that was possible. But before I begin, I'd like to quote Tim Ingold, who is the center of this quote here. And Tim Ingold is, I would call a more of a classical anthropologist, in the sense that he integrates physical, biological, culture, linguistics, religion, history, all of these approaches, even philosophy, all of these approaches to understanding the human condition, and really tries to understand, what does this mean? And a lot of his work surrounds this idea of, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a human in this world today? And he quite often, like most, such as myself, needs to situate a cross-cultural argument within the dominant scientific paradigm. So the science dominates our understandings of things. And in this presentation, I'm not suggesting that science is wrong. I'm just suggesting that there is more to be known from other disciplines that can help inform science, and can lead to a more complete science. And there is, in many ways, a bit of a science of the unknown. So I'm just going to actually read the whole quote, and you will see on the screen here just only part of this quote. So in this particular section of his book, The Perception of the Environment, Tim Ingold is situating Algonquian, Anishinaabe, and Cree hunting and engagement with the land. And he situates this within a hunter-gatherer paradigm, and he critiques science. So he says, so is the scientist a person rather than an organism? And so what he's doing here is he's critiquing the scientific gaze. And so when the scientific gaze, we position it as being neutral and objective, or controlling for bias. And so it positions itself that way. So again, coming back to Ingold, he says, so is the scientist a person rather than an organism? And he raises the question, how can we exist both inside the world of nature and outside of it as organisms and persons at one and the same time? There seems to me to be only one way out of the paradoxes and the contradictions entailed in modern science's attitude to humanity. This is to build on the premise that all organisms, including human ones, are not things but beings. As beings, persons are organisms, and being organisms, they or we are not impartial observers of nature, but participate within the continuum of organic life. So basically what Ingold is saying here, and if you perhaps caught what he's saying here, but really what he's saying is, from the scientific perspective, we can't exist outside of it and inside of it at the same time. We're in this world, and how we engage with this world informs how we experience it. And specific to Indigenous Education Week, we can see how this is applicable. So if you are not familiar with Indigenous issues, you must rely upon, a scant understanding perhaps, or perhaps it's incorrect, and that may inform how you approach subject matter. So if you can situate this within science, then how does a scientist engage with Indigenous knowledge systems or Indigenous healing, right? So the scientist is part of the world, and therefore is influenced by perspectives of that world, and therefore cannot truly be outside of it. So for Tim Ingold, the only true scientist would be an actual non-human who does not live in this world and would view the activities that we are doing outside of this world. So it's a little bit of a deep thought there, but I like to begin by that, with that statement, just to situate the subject matter, because quite often when we think about it, talk about it, we are left to rely upon how we were nurtured and enculturated to think about these ideas. And quite often there's an absence of that, right? So think about how much you know about traditional medicine, and think about how you come to know that information, what's the source of that information. And if you don't know a lot about it, then you know that this is really part of what he's talking about here. So let me next move on to placebo. So this presentation is really all about expanding upon what that means within an Indigenous traditional medicine and healing framework. So I'm not approaching a discussion of placebo or nocebo within a biomedical framework. So if there's questions specific to that, my approach here is to actually expand and critique and engage in conversation about the challenges. There's a lot of really interesting literature on this subject, and it's really expanding, and those who are expanding this conversation are biomedical scientists, and you know, they have more, they're the experts on placebo. I'm more of an emerging expert on the traditional medicine side of things. So according to Gupta and Verma, 2013, a placebo is seen as an inert substance or procedure, and the placebo effect or response is something that follows the administration of a placebo. So quite often when you read or you view the media or read newspaper stories, you may come across this concept of the placebo in a medical trial, that they quite often will use a placebo to test the efficacy of a medicine that's on trial, and that's what's going on with the COVID-19, for instance, at this moment. So nocebo is actually the opposite of that. And so according to Plains and Mollart, Villiers and Mollart, the nocebo effect refers by definition to the induction or the worsening of symptoms induced by sham or active therapies. So I think there's a lot to learn from even how these kinds of words are described. And quite often when scientists are writing about placebo and nocebo, sometimes there's not really a degree of complexity that they engage upon. It's almost as though it's dismissive, right? So when Plains, Villiers, and Mollart are talking about nocebo, they use the word sham, right? So sham carries a lot of connotations about something like as though it is not real, and therefore, however, despite the fact that it's not real, it seems to have an outcome, right, or an effect. Benedetti, who is an Italian researcher, medical researcher, has done quite a bit on placebo. And what's interesting about Benedetti's work is he's demonstrating how there's more to learn about what placebos are, and he's shown that if patients view painkillers being administered to them, it will have a stronger effect than if they did not view it happening. So the actual meaning response, or the actual witnessing or observing, can actually have a stronger effect than what we think it can. So for Benedetti, the psychosocial context is crucial. And he's a researcher who's taken on this at a more comprehensive level to try to understand what's all at play here. Because some people, if they are in the right psychosocial context, they can actually contribute to the healing process itself. And sometimes when we visit a biomedical practitioner, if this is our main medical system that we use, we can actually begin the healing process even before consuming medicines themselves. But my approach is mostly informed by Daniel Moorman's work. And so Daniel Moorman is an anthropologist who's focused on traditional medicine. He's probably written, well, he has written since other earlier anthropologists, the most comprehensive account of traditional medicine. So he's actually written encyclopedias and dictionaries of traditional medicines of North America. So if you're interested in learning a bit more, you can look up his work and you can read his material. And he's documented the indigenous, the words quite often, the Latin word and describe them. So what Mormon is interested in is really understanding what does this placebo mean. And for Mormon, it's not an accurate descriptor of what's actually going on. And for Mormon, the word placebo should be abandoned because it's too broadly used. And I'll read a quote. He says that if we must keep it, we should use it only to refer to the changes observed in the subjects in a control group in an experiment. So he does see value in it being used within a biomedical experiment, but he questions its use outside of that. And what Mormon is interested in is much of the same things that Ingold was interested in. How our environment, whether it's our physical environment or our social environment, helps inform life itself. And there are many symbols in the world that give meaning to it and that can affect how we are or how we think of the world. We can have seasons that affect our mood. We can have subject matter affect our mood. Quite often when I talk about Indigenous content, I can engage emotion in an audience and a student audience, and sometimes that's positive and sometimes that's negative. So what's going on here, right? So for Mormon, meaning affects life and life affects meaning. And for Mormon, people are simultaneously biological and cultural creatures. So we're both one at the same time. And quite often what we try to do is we try to disassociate one over the other, where we have those in the humanities and the social sciences perhaps focusing more on the social and the cultural, and those in the sciences focusing on the biological. And sometimes there's not always that engagement or that connection that's happening between them both. So for, again, for Mormon, he suggests that meaning response is more accurate because there's a lot going on here, and it's actually not inert. So inert would suggest that there's nothing going on and nothing should therefore happen, but there's actually something that's happening. So this is why he says we should change the terminology. So for Mormon, meaning response means, quote, the psychological or physiological effect of meaning in the treatment of illness and elsewhere. And Nocebo is, using his words, it's the evil twin of the meaning response. So if we can expect to be healed, we can become healed. And if we expect to experience ill health, we can actually begin experiencing ill health. So I will situate this meaning response then within a traditional medicine framework just to begin a conversation that really, I would say, and this is my opinion, legitimizes its study, because quite often when we think about this, we associate it with elders, or we associate it with knowledge holders or healers, and we don't really, we just assume that it doesn't work, or that it's not, it doesn't have any efficacy because of the way that we were socialized. So the term itself is problematic because when we see the word traditional, we're thinking about a time way back when, and that, you know, it's ideas from the past that are applied in the present, and perhaps then it is dated, static. However, that's not the actual situation. According to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the first real spirited attempt to define it in a contemporary context defines it as practices designed to promote the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of individuals. So it's a really, this is where this idea of holism comes into play. And however, they do not add any specific descriptors to what that might mean, but only to define it more generally. And quite often in Indigenous cultures, there is no word for healing and well-being. There are words that are very close to it, but there's not always a precise definition. And just on this idea here, this subject, Daniel Mormon has looked at this as well, and he's compared different languages in the world. And different languages don't always have a precise translation for every single word or concept that is used in one culture, for instance, in Western culture, or in using the English language, for instance. And so this is not something that's unique to Indigenous peoples. It's something that is a global phenomenon, that, you know, there's not always a precise definition, which suggests that there's variation. There's variation in seeing the world because language is a byproduct of how you see the world. So, so what about then traditional healing? The most common text that we consult Aboriginal Healing in Canada by Waldrum Herring and Young. They report healing in the past and present. And one of the things that they report is that it has a positive effect, right? So it's quite often reported in the historical literature as though it is made up. For instance, it's a sleight of hand is a common descriptor of what traditional healing is. And the European observers, who are quite often the observers, write about it in a dismissive way to suggest that, well, this is not really anything significant or real. They're trying to trick the patient, and they're using sleight of hand techniques, and they're engaging with the spirits, and this is what they're doing as a mechanism to healing. So so the problem then is the purpose of this presentation is the skepticism. So I raise skepticism with a question mark, and it's something that you could think about on at your own end. Does this raise a skepticism for you? And does this conjure up images of a placebo, right? So if these individuals are becoming healed, how do we account for that? If we look at it from a reductionist perspective, then we must try to narrow it down. Waldrum Herring and Young state that it's very difficult to study these healing practices because they're rather complex, and there's a whole lot going on, and it's hard to narrow down one element of it. So I think the meaning response is something that we can consider. And so I raised the meaning with a question mark, only to say that, you know, it's one of a few ways of approaching it, and that's the approach that I'll focus on. More detail here. So in terms of Anishinaabe healing, quite a bit of my work has focused on how we define it within Anishinaabe Medewan perspective. And I know that's not the only one. One of the benefits of taking this analytical approach from a historical or ethnohistorical perspective is that there's literature on it. So Walter J. Hoffman, who was a physician and amateur ethnologist, some would say an early anthropologist, went to visit the Ojibwe or the Chippewa of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and he began writing down their healing, their medical system. And it was something that he could approach with some way of comparison because he was a healer himself. He was a medical doctor. So he wrote about the Medewan, and which he defined as the Grand Medicine Society. I've heard elders and knowledge holders define it quite a bit differently. One definition that I've come across is it means from my heart to yours. It comes from the word de, which is ande, which means heart, and it's about this connection that one has, and it's a healing system that comes from the heart. And so Hoffman identifies 4 healers: the Wabano, the Jesuit, the Mishkikeonene, and the Mide. So the Wabano and the Jesuit use ceremony. Jesuit in particular uses what we call the shaking tent ceremony. Some would call it a turtle lodge in contemporary context. The Mishkikeonene is a herbalist, and it could be Mishkike Ninikwe, who was also female. It wasn't limited to male or female. I was open to both, and all had some basic knowledge of herbs. The Mede was in many ways an all-encompassing practitioner, I suppose, a kind of a general practitioner, perhaps, in many ways. And so quite often when we talk about Anishinaabe healing, those of us who do research and write about it will focus mostly on those who do it for the appropriate purposes. We don't often talk about the bad Mede, or those who are in it for other purposes. And so there are those who actually use healing for nefarious purposes. And so for Hoffman, he writes about the evil Medewan practitioner who he calls the bad Mede, and I'll just read what he has to say. So, quote, a bad Mede is one who employs his powers for evil purposes. He has the power of assuming the form of any animal in which he may destroy the life of his victim, immediately after which he resumes his human form and appears innocent of any crime. His services are sought by people who wish to encompass the destruction of enemies or rivals, at however remote a locality the intended victim may be at that time, end quote. So we don't quite often talk about this, but it is something that is actually part of the living memory and contemporary Indigenous community in terms of an understanding that healing is powerful and it's also a gift. However, it's possible for individuals to use that for purposes that are not good for bad purposes. And one thing that I quite often come across in community is this idea that you must not assume each healer is there to help you. So you must be cautious of it, and you must determine this in the process of seeking out the services of a healer. So in terms of the research that I did on this, I looked at the integration of traditional medicine in a clinical setting on Manitoulin Island. And when I was doing so, the definition that best described this process of healing was a good holistic way of life. And so it wasn't something that was specific to the ingestion of material substances. So we quite often think of the herbalist as the traditional medicine man or woman. It may involve counseling. It may involve ceremony. It may involve, it will always involve self-directed healing. And quite often a healer will tell a patient that it wasn't me who healed you, you actually healed yourself. I just simply helped to show the way. And by way of definition, quite often these are spoken about as this body, spirit, earth connection. And in the research that I do, I collect oral histories of this subject, and I compare that with the written word, and that's something that I'm doing here right now. And specific to how this is done on Manitoulin, in the clinical setting that I observed this, they had a council of elders and knowledge holders who would essentially I will say vet a healer, and to determine that they have a reputation of being a good healer, and or they would ensure that the bad healers would not be part of the clinic. Which, if you do it by comparison, there's similar procedures in place in biomedicine. So I'm going to next go to a teaching. And I won't spend a lot of time on this teaching, but again, coming back to meaning in the world, this is important. So within, this is a Medeoan teaching, but it's also, obviously, it's also Anishinaabe. So within Anishinaabe teachings, there's this understanding that we enter this world from another world, and that our bodies are shells that are carrying our spirit. And as we move forward in this world, we're on a path in life, and we're on this journey. However, this journey and path in life is beset with temptations or challenges. And so we engage upon these challenges, and we have to make a decision. And that decision can be a life or death decision, and it could actually lead to an exit in this world. And so on this image here that I have drawn here, it shows what this means. And each stage shows that it's possible to go off that path of life and venture into the next world, or to continue on. And so there's other teachings about this. There's the 4 Hills of Life teaching that Basil Johnson writes about it. There's also the 7 stages of life that many elders will share about. It basically accounts for different stages in our lives that are characterized by each life cycle, and quite often we'll talk about the challenges that we face in overcoming them. And once we reach the end, which is at the far end, we've reached the pinnacle of our existence. So being an elder, and we possess knowledge, and we hold knowledge, and we teach people about the journey that we have. And within Indigenous societies, such as the Anishinaabe, an elder is held in high regard because they've been able to overcome these temptations, and they've lived a respectful and spiritual life. And quite often these ideas are encapsulated in this term, Minopomatswin. So you probably, or some of you may have heard about this word. It's quite often stated without explained. One of the contemporary writings of it that I particularly find helpful is Roger Spielman's work. In his book, You're So Fat, he talks to an Algonquin elder who gives a teaching. And Roger writes this teaching out in Algonquin and he translates it. And so you could read this in his book. Essentially, the teaching is about Minnebanzowin, but it's not precisely spelled out directly. It's almost indirectly spoken about. And what is core to this idea of Minnebanzowin is respect and social harmony. So to lead a healthy life, you must be in harmonious relationship with your community members and also the non-human beings in this world, the earth beings, the spirit beings, and the human beings. And you must attempt to maintain that that harmonious relationship. And it's not to say that it's this nostalgic, romanticized indigenous perspective, but it's also it's to really say that there is a challenge in that. And if you look at that image that I show here, there is not a linear transgression transition from one end to the other. There's movement, there's challenges, and sometimes one exits this world before they were intended to do. So this is what Arthur Kleinman talks in explanatory model of how to live life, and also healthy living. It gives a perspective of the philosophy or the theory of wellness from an indigenous perspective, right? So it's not reductionist. It takes into consideration the human connection one has to one another, the community, the animals, and the land. And in order to achieve a healthy way of life, you must recognize that and try to achieve harmony in doing so. However, this harmony has not always been the case. So we might want to think about, past indigenous society again as being this unproblematic existence. However, like all human societies, there were challenges, and some of the teachings talk about this. It all depends on the teachings that you've heard. But I've come across teachings that the Anishinaabe peoples were not always getting along. That in the past there was jealousy, and there was stress. Early anthropologists such as Diamond Gennis, who did work in Parry Sound, which is not too far from, obviously everyone knows that's not too far from Sudbury. So some of these ideas are local. Hollowell has done work in Manitoba, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and parts of Ontario, mostly in Manitoba. I just want to quote Diamond Gennis. And this is in 1929 in what we now call Wasauksing, or also Parry Island Reserve, just outside of Parry Sound. So to quote Diamond Gennis, first of all, he says that sorcery was commonplace in Anishinaabe society in the past. And to quote Gennis, he states that every man suspects his neighbor of practicing the nefarious art to avenge some fancied grievance, and the older and more conservative the Indian, the more he is held in suspicion. Probably there is not a single adult on the island who has not been accused of sorcery at some time or another, and who has not himself suffered some misfortune which he attributes to the same cause. And most of the work to really understand what this means is achieved by Hollowell, who calls this personalistic theory of causation, which means to say that there are no random events in this world. All of the events that happen due to the actions of persons. And these persons can be human, they can be your fellow neighbor, or they can be the animal beings, they can be the spirit beings that we don't see. And so there's nothing that happens randomly within this way of viewing the world. Everything happens for some reason, and that reason is a transgression. So if you are mysteriously, well, I wouldn't say mysteriously because that's the wrong word, but if you become ill, you did not become ill because of a virus. You became ill because you treated your neighbor disrespectfully, or perhaps you went for a hunt and you did not treat the the animal with care after you had killed it, after it sacrificed itself to you. And so it's this idea then that it's this constant message. It's almost like health promotion, that if you want to live a healthy life, you must treat one another respectfully. And if you treat one another respectfully, then it is the preferred path that you must take in life that will lead to these outcomes. So it's a kind of a way of mediating how we interact and engage. So what I have here is taken from a birch bark scroll, again, collected by Hoffman. And I chose to use this one just to demonstrate how this actually has an impact. So, you know, we can read Hollowell, we can read Jennis, and we can say, well, you know, those are interesting ideas. And okay, there's jealousy, there's community stress. You know, well, what does that actually look like? And so what Hoffman did is he conducted a more detailed analysis of what this image looks like. And so what he shows here is number one is what you would call, I suppose, a bad midday practitioner. And number two is a person who approaches this healer to say that there's an individual who is causing me stress in my life. And I'm just paraphrasing this story here. And that I am seeking your guidance to use your power against this person. The images to the left indicate the degree. So this is a 4th degree midday one. So number 3 is 1st degree, 4 is 2nd, 5th is 3rd, 6th is 4th. And so you can see that by the notches on the top. And in this particular instance, this midday conducts a ceremony. And this individual that is creating hardship so this individual is number 8. And number 8 was creating hardship for number 2. Number 2 consults with number 1 and says that, you know, I would like you to help me to heal this, you know, it's causing a lot of problems for me. So number 1 conducts a ceremony and puts vermilion on the heart of number 8. So number 7 is vermilion. And so he, by way of ceremony, puts vermilion on the individual, and the individual becomes ill and dies of pneumonia the next spring after the ceremony takes place. So this is in many ways an oral history about, you know, this is how these healing practices can be used to achieve this outcome. And so how do we begin to understand that, right? So using the frameworks that we have, in whichever framework you use, how does that actually how do we come to know and understand or make sense of this, right? So if we take a biomedical framework that in using the researchers that I've stated earlier, we can say, well, this is nocebo, right? This individual, or perhaps there's absolutely no connection because there's no evidence to demonstrate a precise connection between this person's pneumonia and this ceremony that took place. So that's, you know, maybe a skeptical biomedical framework where you require evidence to arrive at a conclusion. However, within this Anishinaabe perspective, this actually happened. This actually makes sense because within these Minobo-Matsuen teachings, we must always respect one another to the best of our ability. And if we do not do so, then we can engage the services of a healer who can help heal the situation that we're faced with. So this is really an explanatory model of healing from this community stress that's taking place, an explanatory model of what Jennis is talking about when he writes about this jealousy that's taking place. And Hollowell himself has also written about this jealousy that's taking place. And specific to Jennis, if you read his work, he talks about how many people are suspicious of one another, and they're suspicious of one another because of the stress that is caused by colonization. So there's these bigger picture ideas that are beginning to influence how these outcomes take place. So that's an example then of how do we understand that. And so, you know, if you're skeptical and this doesn't really interest you, then you could just, you know, ignore it and kind of write it off. But if you're a researcher such as myself, I find it fascinating because you know, it's a way of understanding how we engage with the power of healing or not to heal, and how healing can mean something different in a certain context. So I just want to return. So by way of a conclusion here, I have about 8 minutes left. So I just want to return to, the argument that I made that, and it's one that Mormon proposes, is that the word placebo is not helpful in beginning to understand what's going on here. And it's not helpful because it's too broad, and it's almost used as a dismissive a category, like this kind of Cartesian opposition that if I don't know what's going on here, then it's a placebo, right? And so it just kind of pushes away things. And I don't suggest that everyone thinks that way, but the way that it's written about in the medical literature presents itself that way. And again, what Mormon says, we are both simultaneously biological and cultural. So even though we are operationalizing biology, we are actual cultural beings. And as cultural beings, we are enculturated to view the world in a particular kind of way. And so if you are Anishinaabe holding these worldviews that I've just shared, then that is very significant on how you experience this world. In terms of the meaning response for Mormon and others who take this approach, it has psychological and biological effects, right? So what I'm actually doing here now is I'm translating this indigenous perspective, or this indigenous experience, or this human experience of healing, because it's cross-cultural. This is what happens with all peoples in time and place when they seek out healing. So there is a psychological process that is taking place, but there's also a biological process. And we don't all use the same words, but I'm using words that are compatible with a biomedical framework. So what is Anishinaabe traditional medicine? So quite often we think about traditional medicine as something that's material. And we think that it's material because we're conditioned to think that way. It's like it's the white man's Indian that Berker-Hoffer writes about, that media, historical writing portrays the healer holding substances and giving that substance to another individual. So we have a tendency to think of healing in terms of materiality, but it goes well beyond that. It's actually mostly not materials, right? And in terms of how a traditional healing takes place, it's guided by what's referred to as Odswin, like our life world, our life. So life is the spirit that we hold, that Odswin. So Odswin is the root word in Bomodswin, or sometimes I've also heard Minido Odswin to talk about the spiritual life. But the core of this is Odswin, referring to that spirit that's in us. And so if you think about that, this term is used in the present and used in varying contexts, and it's still being used. So what are those ideas that are informing that idea? And so what is the precise translation of Odswin? I can't use the exact words in English because I can't think of those words that exist, but life world to me seems to be the closest. Others will use other words to describe it. So the research that I've done in the past really focused on what does healing mean for contemporary Anishinaabe people. And consistently, I was told by clients of the traditional healing program I was looking at, I was told that belief is crucial. And what I was told by them is that if you do not believe in traditional medicine, it's not going to work for you. If you don't believe in it, you're wasting your time. Don't even bother seeing a healer because it's not going to work for you. But if you believe in it, it will work for you. And I believe in it, and it's worked for me. So that was one core message that I received, and I spoke to people with chronic disease, and were able to see a traditional healer, and were guided in quite often either managing it to a greater degree, or sometimes being healed completely. And what is the reason for that? That's beyond the approach that I take. So I'm more focused on the meaning effects of things. And so when we understand, or we begin to try to understand traditional medicine and the history of traditional medicine, standpoint is crucial and it's core. Because if I were taking a biomedical standpoint, and I'm not trying to pick on biomedicine, but it's something we can all recognize, I could be dismissive of all of that I'm reading. And it's also important to understand that you will not effectively describe phenomena without understanding the context in which the phenomena exists. So if you don't understand how the Anishinaabe view the world, it's very difficult to understand what traditional medicine means within an Anishinaabe perspective. So in the work that I do, I use the word standpoint. It's something it's actually a feminist term. There's also indigenous standpoint. I find it helpful because it seems to be more effective in conveying what I'm trying to say. In anthropology, we use the term cultural relativism, but when we use the word standpoint, we recognize that each of us has different kinds of experiences of this world that is influenced by gender, class, ethnicity, culture, all those sorts of things. And that standpoint then impacts the way that we see this world. And so I think standpoint is an effective way of beginning to understand what this all means. And so that's the approach that I take. So, Misawe, that is it. So that's my presentation on the problem of placebo and nocebo in traditional medicine. Basically, the core message that I have is that it's not an appropriate description of understanding the healing that's taking place, because there's a complexity of things going on. And we must understand that complexity of those things that are going on to really, truly understand what is taking place. So I'll take some questions. There are some.
Wow. I think I have a lot of questions. I'm really curious about some of the things that you talked about, but there's a lot to process. And so you covered everything from, looking at the scientific gaze. I thought that was really a good thing to bring up, a really interesting perspective, how people are stuck in this idea that you have to legitimize medicines. And then you have the biomedical point of view that's really just probably looking at things like tea, and testing that in a clinical trial to say, does it work or does it not? But then when you think about the standpoint or the worldview aspect, and you have to believe in this for it to work, and I wonder if that would be the same thing in a biomedical perspective. If you go in for a specific type of medication and you don't believe it's going to help you, will it be the same kind of nocebo effect? And do they study that in the same way? Are they applying those terms only to traditional medicine, or are they actually using those terms as well when they're looking at something, the efficacy of a medicine in their kind of biomedical framework? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so the response that I have to that is, if you didn't believe in biomedicine, you wouldn't go see a biomedical practitioner in the first place. Mm-hmm. So by acknowledging its existence, you believe in it, right? Mm-hmm. And so in terms of all of the other components of it, I can't answer all of those in the degree of detail required. However, if Mormon has looked at this, spent his whole career looking at what this means. And so he has some of the answers to the questions that you raised, but what he really focuses on, and is something that I support as well, he focuses on this idea that we don't have all of the answers, mm-hmm. that there's so much more to know. And in the work that I do and the teaching that I do, I focus on that we actually don't have all the answers to things. And sometimes we act as though we do, or we exercise what we know in order to justify dismissing other perspectives or other ways. And so that's really where my approach is in this.
Mm-hmm. I think there might be a few questions from maybe Amy or Home. Do you have a comment or question? Amy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I thought it was a really great presentation. And just to comment that I think it's really interesting how people place so much stock in the, Western medical system, a system that can, in many cases, owes the progress that it's made and certain things about it to really old medical systems like the Chinese medical system, Ayurveda, indigenous knowledge, and all of that. But yet, indigenous medicine is looked upon with skepticism and stuff. So I think that's an interesting, my point of view from this presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and if I could just add that, one of the messages that I hope to share is that I'm not dismissing anything, but I'm suggesting that we should embrace that there needs to be more work and research and perhaps there's answers to things that we don't know yet, and we wouldn't know that until we actually begin the research and treat it as a legitimate way of healing. Then, you know, perhaps there's some answers there that we can benefit from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really think that the quote you shared about Ingold was a really great way to settle that in a nice way, thinking that we are part of the system and not above it, like, you know, these foreign observers. And I think sometimes some of the ideas around science are that we are above and that we are unbiased and that we're able to do that without any kind of personal imposition, but that's obviously not the case, right? So I thought that was a really great quote to share. Holm, do you have a comment or a question?
Of course. Let me congratulate you, sir, for this really, really great, you know, the concept and idea that I'm really interested very beginning as a medical anthropology student, and I really like to, you know, to do my PhD on this particular traditional healing medicine topic. Is there any possibilities here?
I think so. You know, you know, there's an interdisciplinary program at Laurentian. There's two programs at PhD level. You know, I think you would need to discuss that with the coordinators, and they can answer if something like that is, if your idea is compatible with their program. And I'm not the coordinator, so I can't answer that. But I think, you know, it's worth a conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, and one more thing I'm really interested about, you know, you're talking about the jealousy stress. So that is really, you know, the common in our country as well, in our community, in our culture, it happens, and as well as skepticism is really common, you know, in our traditional healing practice. So I really interesting. So it's a really, you know, the new knowledge for me. And yeah, I think that's my comments. Yeah, so I really impressed and I really admired bring this, you know, the issues, bring this new idea. So I'm so grateful, I'm so pleased, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So I think what's important to emphasize in the idea of the stress and jealousy is quite often in communities we'll think that, you know, this is something that's just with us now. And, you know, I live in community, and those who I hear stories from in other communities, you hear narratives of, you know, this community stress that's resulting in, you know, lateral violence and sometimes physical violence or self-directed violence. But if you look at the historical record, and, you know, it's not perfect, you know, if you look at some of the sources, we can see that it's been there before, right? And so what led to that, right? And so, you know, some have suggested that, you know, when things were too challenging and stressful, you would have people leave to address the issue, right? And this is where a lot of these, you know, tribal groups start emerging, that, you know, we're once part of one, and, you know, it just accommodates, I suppose, these stressful situations. But in contemporary context, we don't always have those opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So how about, sorry, so how about the ceremonies, you know, sometimes, you know, the ceremonies is being, you know, as an integral, you know, the part of the wellness and well-being, even in our culture as well. So how we integrate, you know, the ritual ceremony, like, for example, you know, the sweat lodge, or, you know, the what is called medicine walk, and, you know, the power dance and something like that.
Yeah, all I can say is that, you know, they're there, and people report, you know, benefiting from them. And another thing I'd like to add to what you've just shared, Home, is that, you know, sometimes healing doesn't necessarily have to take place in a ceremony. It can take place by meeting with an elder or someone with a lot of experience and just sharing your, you know, whatever is on your mind. Or sometimes there might not be anything on your mind, and you just simply need someone to talk to. And these are indigenous forms of counseling in many ways, right? They're the indigenous forms of social work that existed before social work was here for us, right? So healing is rather complex, and so it's not something that is always as obvious as we think it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, sir. It's a great kind of healing.
Like you said, you healed yourself, right? So I really thought that was very poignant as well. We had Julie Oswagosh with us earlier this week, and she shared all kinds of teachings and talked about the ceremonies that she runs and her experiences around that. And you definitely see how sometimes it is just sitting, and sometimes it's going through a sweat, how that can set off something within that person that sets off a chain event of healing that occurs afterwards, right? So it's a whole complex system of things that come together. I'm curious about bad midday, and I'm wondering how that's received when you talk about it, because sometimes you hear rumblings of this very quietly, I think, and people always go to colonization saying that that's what has created this kind of, illness within society where people would use their power for harm. So I thought it was really interesting that the way that you talked about that. How is that received when you talk about it? Are people agreeing with you that it's always been there, or are people resistant to that idea?
Good question. I actually never asked, so I don't know the answer to that. But I think we're uneasy. So even as academics, we're uneasy to talk about this kind of thing because it could be used against Indigenous peoples, and it could be used against Indigenous peoples in the way that critics will say, they'll come across thinking that I knew that there was something wrong with this. I knew that it was not appropriate, and all the while not really looking at it from comparative context, right? So in biomedicine, we have malpractice, we have abuse of patients, sexual abuse of patients, for instance, and so those kinds of things are there, but we don't really, we kind of conveniently exclude them from comparative analysis sometimes. So I think what the kind of work that I like to do is really legitimize, the pros and cons, right? So perfection doesn't exist in any system. So that's something I haven't come across it yet. So, when it happens, I'll be very happy to know that there is something something perfect exists as a human made system. So, I'm just interested in the total picture, right? And based on the research that I've done, I think it's been there, right? So when do you trace the origins of it? It's very difficult because of the preservation of the record, the preservation of the oral historical record, the exclusion in the written record. But if you look at it from the framework, there is this idea that is an Indigenous idea that we must treat one another well. And if we don't treat one another well, then misfortune may happen. And there's plenty of stories collected of hunters who all of a sudden are no longer successful in their hunt. And they use this idea that it must be for the reason that I did something wrong, right? So this idea of doing something wrong and leading to a negative outcome is there, right? I think it's been exacerbated by colonialism, because now we have communities that are, maybe on reserve or faced with poverty, who where they don't have opportunities to explore, dealing with this in a more open, autonomous way. And now it's a more constricted existence, and you don't have an opportunity to set up a new community if you needed to, for instance, right? Those kinds of things are there. So I do think it's rather complex, and I won't dismiss the challenges with talking about it. But I think that if we are to move forward, scholarship in this area, we must account for all of its attributes rather than select them, right? And it's important to do that, because that will lead to a maturation of the scholarship, and that's something that I seek to do.
Mm-hmm. Wow, lots to think about.
Yeah.
I'd like to open it up if anybody else has questions or comments to add to that. I think we'll be thinking about this for a little while, and maybe we'll be writing you emails in the next week to ask for clarification on certain points. Maybe one thing I'd be curious about, because you hear, and I think there is a bit of research in ideas around religiosity, and you see this on TV in these mega churches where people are being healed by someone's touch. Are people quick to make those kinds of comparisons when you're talking about modern religious ideas versus traditional Indigenous ways of healing and knowing the natural world?
So I think that, so in my, I don't have, I haven't had a lot of conversations, but I've been at least in at least one where a scholar in Africa was talking about how, politicians are using, this as a way of ensuring power over people, for instance. And I would say that that does happen in Indigenous contexts, right? So the healer is like, obviously from what I've talked about here, it's not only always done for positive purposes, right? Sometimes, there's always this idea that you must be cautious. You must always be cautious. You must be cautious of many things, because you never know when, it may be the guise of another healer, for instance, who is wishing ill will on you. So there is that idea. And I would say that there is the potential that these can be used for all of the wrong reasons, right? So there are, you read in the media of people who are, are charlatans trying to set up cults, the equivalent of cults, and using these ideas for their own gain. So that's there, it must be acknowledged. And so, how do you, take that all apart and break it down and understand it? So, it's not always either or situation, right? It's sometimes much more complicated. So I don't have the full answer to that, but I can just say that, there are many complex situations that may occur in these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Yeah, I know that we've gone well beyond the allotted time, so but I am here for at least another 15 minutes. I do have.
Maybe I'm talking too much and they don't want to speak up.
So I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is that what I presented here today is the early stages of a paper, right? So quite often it's something that I've been thinking about. I've done research on actually bad medicine, right? So I've actually explicitly done research on that. But in this particular presentation, I was much more focused on accounting for that outcome, right? So accounting for what leads to that outcome. So basically, it's this idea that if you feel as though someone has is using bad medicine on you, that can actually lead to ill health, right? And it's the converse of that, right? So both sides exist, that if you can heal yourself, or you can actually experience ill health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so whether it's placebo and nocebo, it's the power of the mind that's guiding the body to do what it's doing to a certain degree.
To a certain degree, but concepts of the mind are not universal, so it's specific to the context, I would say, as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So is there any correlation between bad medicine and nocebo?
Well, I think that there hasn't been a lot of research on that, right? So basically, the early anthropological research was just describing it, just writing it down, just like describing what was occurring. I haven't come across yet. I always come across it in healing and recovery context, right? So in addiction, so I do some work in addiction and how traditional healing is used in that manner. So it's quite often always this the lens is always focusing on how it's helpful for an individual or a community, but it doesn't always focus on some of the other components of it, right? So I chose in this presentation to highlight other ways of looking at it, just to complement those other studies.
It's wonderful.
All right.
Emily?
Yes.
I really miss, the Elder Julie's presentation last week. So do you have any record of that presentation?
We do. So for anyone who's interested, if you go on the LUL Indigenous Programs Facebook page or the ISA Facebook page, we also have an ISA YouTube channel. So we're lucky enough to be able to take these presentations and share them over and over again so that you can participate live or on your time if you're able to.
Yeah, sure. So
So,
I really missed that presentation last week.
well, and with many elders, but with Julie, every time I meet her, I have a different perspective on things, and it takes a while for things to process, I think. And so hearing what she had to say on Monday, and now hearing what you had to say today, Daryl, I think it really matches quite nicely, and I think it really makes you think about our worldview in regards to health and wellness, our worldview in regards to relations, whether it's the natural world, ourselves, or each other, and then the power of the mind in doing all of these things together. And I think more and more now with videos online like this, we're able to have those conversations, and people are able to go out onto the land. And we saw Joseph Pinawannaquit not too long ago. So the practice of going to learn about medicines and harvesting, that itself is medicine, right? So you start to see how your health comes out in all kinds of different ways, and the actions that you take are also about your health, not just about ideas around drinking tea. And I think that from certain biomedical perspectives, that's all that they're thinking about. They're not going much further than that. They're just trying to legitimize or delegitimize something, right, from a superficial way.
If I could just add a little bit more to what you stated, coming back to my research, I found that the healer would always focus on teaching the individual to learn how to heal themselves, right? So it's a different kind of approach. I collected a story of a client in the traditional program being taken outside to their own backyard, and the healer would say, this will help you with this, this is what help you with this, and this is how you actually begin to process it, to harvest it. And so I quite often find that really the healers see themselves more often than not as a conduit to each individual's journey, that there's a really focus on autonomy, that I can't help you, you can only help yourself. And so I'm going to help show you that way, whether it's by way of harvesting or it's by way of learning how to live life in a different kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so about respect and personal responsibility towards yourself, I think, eh? Well, so last chance if there's any questions. If not, I'd like to really thank you for taking the time to talk to us about some of these topics, and I look forward to seeing how this evolves into a paper. I think lots of us are very curious to see how this will go. And I'm very thankful that we now know more about the Hannah Chair, the history of that, and understanding what your role is at NOSM. So although you're not too far away from Laurentian, you're still connected to Laurentian, it's good to see that you're in a position where you can do great work that can progress all of these ideas and get more visibility about these topics in the biomedical world and that whole side of things.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all our participants, and again, thank you to Dr. Daryl Manitowabi for sharing his expertise with us.
Thank you so much, sir. Have a good day.